Guess that is it. So here we go.
And here we go. It's Friday Geeks, and you're watching another edition of the Friday Night Geek Show. I'm Dante D, and welcome to the channel where we talk about comic books and other geek stuff. Joining me tonight is everyone's favorite comic book guru, Eric Breen. He's kind of been like my sidekick last few podcasts that we've done. Eric, how's it going?
Going pretty well. How you doing?
I can't complain. I've still been in the house and under quarantine. I mean, I go to work, but it's just work and staying home, and that's about it. Same thing for you, or?
No, we can pretty much come and go as we please at this point.
Okay.
We wear the masks, but other than that, we're pretty much. Yeah, there's some restrictions on bars and restaurants. Late in the evening, but. I said it's we've pretty much been set free.
Enough that you can go to your comic book store. That's the only thing that's important right now, right?
I worked at my comic book store yesterday.
Oh, you did?
Yes.
You did. Awesome.
And after they got done adding up the comics I was buying, I made $1.25 an hour.
Yeah, that's the problem about being interested in what you're selling is half the time you end up going broke instead of making money, right?
I actually figured I was just going to do it, for comics yesterday because I was, I'm friends with the guy. Actually, the guy I've been dealing with for almost 40 years, he retired. His son-in-law runs the store now. And so I went out there to help them yesterday. I will probably end up working there, full time. So I just went out there to kind of get back in the swing of things. Found out I'm not even in comic book store working shape anymore.
Well, you know what? I kind of envy you, and I've always wanted to work in a comic book store. We got some people rolling in here slowly. Make yourselves known. Don't be shy. Let us know if you're here, and let us know if you have worked in a comic book store or you are currently working in a comic book store. I think that would be really cool. But you've all didn't come here to talk about our work history. You came here to talk about comic books, so that's what we're going to talk about. And specifically what we're going to be talking about tonight is the evolution of comic book stories. So if you take a look at comic book stories today and you take a look at comic book stories from 80 years ago, you will notice a stark difference in the methods of storytelling, not only the art, but the methods of storytelling and the content. You'll probably be able to tell that the stories nowadays are a lot more adult oriented, and they've kind of shifted from starting off as being children's pulp essentially and developing into what we see today with a lot more violence, a lot more adult oriented themes. And we kind of want to examine that and see how that happened exactly, right? So Eric, you have a lot more experience with Golden Age comics than I do. And most of the Golden Age comics that I have read, they've had pretty short, to-the-point stories that were really kid-friendly. Can you think of any Golden Age comic book stories that were a little bit more adult-oriented, or were they just usually more marketed towards children?
Oh, the early Batman stories were very violent. The Joker started off as a homicidal maniac. Batman wasn't necessarily averse to killing himself in those days, but I think I'm going to guess that probably what made the comics shift over to more children's stories. Remember, in the early days of comics, we were in a war, and comics were read by servicemen, and I guess they needed a little bit something more than just something that would be aimed at young children. But I think after the war, we were in a era of peace and prosperity, whatever. What people look for in entertainment shifted, and they realized there's a huge audience of children out there. Remember, television hadn't really taken off yet, so this was something that you could gear towards kids, and if you got a slightly older audience, more is the better. But there was a time when virtually every kid in America was reading comics. And then, then you had companies like EC come along, and for a couple of years it was, like I said, just light and breezy, but then the horror and the crime comics started coming out, and really in the late 40s through the mid 50s, comics were very violent. The horror comics and the crime comics in particular, were, I mean, well, I said that's, there's a reason why, Dr. Wortham, crusaded against him for years.
Exactly.
So yeah, I would say, the very early days, violent, slowed down for a few years, picked back up. And then when the code started, then everything was easily digestible by, from all ages.
Absolutely. And I just wanted to take a moment to kind of give shout outs to the people that are rolling in. McPuffin Muffin. I love that name, and I absolutely love your display picture. Very cute. It says, "Hi, yeah, this sounds like an interesting topic. I'll have to watch it from the beginning as I missed it." I think this is a very interesting topic. I really like examining the evolution of pop culture in general, not just comic books. And C.3. Comics says, "What's up, everyone? Welcome to the stream tonight." And Eric, yeah, you make a really good point, especially with the early Batman stories. Those, for me, from a story perspective, are probably the only tolerable stories for me from the Golden Age. I absolutely love the first Batman story in Detective 27, the Case of the Chemical Syndicate, I think it was. Great story. Even for its time, I thought it was really well done. And then the very first feature in Batman #1, where we're introduced to the Joker, and the Joker's getting on the radio, and all these rich men are dying, and you don't know how he's doing it. I thought that was actually really captivating, especially for the time. But those early Superman stories I found really kind of drab and kind of like, okay, here's Superman. He's like, in Action Comics #1, I think he stopped like how many bad guys? Like 3 or 4. Like it's and there was just little snippets, and like the whole problem is solved within like 4 panels or something. So. Yeah, like what do you think? Are there any? I mean, from a collector's perspective, yeah, Golden Age comics have this appeal. But if we're looking at them from just a story perspective, are there any books from that time that you actually found really captivating, really entertaining?
See, I'm a little different than you on the early Supermans. I actually, I said, Alexander, not here. Just go bother somebody else. Yeah. This all he does. He's obsessed with Doomsday Clock. He comes to everybody's live stream. Knock it off.
Oh, okay.
The early Supermans I thought were actually, kind of cool, because in those, Clark had a little bit of an edge to him. Superman had a definite edge to him. I remember when he first started, he was just as apt to, break down the door of a wife beater and, beat the living daylights out of the guy. But again, those stories ended up becoming more, kid friendly over the years as Superman's power set increased. But those early stories, like the first 5 or 6 years, you can find some, pretty cool stuff in there. And like I said, and then I said, if you consider yourself any kind of comic book historian, you just accept the not so edgy stories. It just, even the light, and airy stories or whatever, you can appreciate, because they're like, each story is like a little time capsule. And, if you get a chance to go back and read some of the Golden Age heroes, like the ones that comprise the JSA, or you go back and like compare Captain Marvel stories to Superman, and how they, wonders that, I said, how, why do people like, Captain Marvel better than Superman? Because for a while it was outselling him, and they were the 2 biggest, kids on the block.
Right.
But yeah, like I said, as far, I mean, you weren't gonna get Tolstoy, you weren't gonna get anything necessarily deep, but again, they had their place, and you can find, a lot of fun stories to read from that era, even if they weren't necessarily, they might have been deep as Dixie cups, but
Right. And Nettie Needlemouse is saying, do you like Doraemon or Doraemon? Do you know what that? I'm actually not familiar with.
No, you've stumped the panel.
Yeah, you stumped the panel. I'm not really sure. Yeah, you'll have to kind of elaborate, Nettie, because I'm not really sure about these particular comics that you're referring to. We'd love to hear about them, if you could kind of elaborate a little bit. But yeah, so with those stories, you mentioned that most kids in America were reading comic books, and that's true because when you I read what's his name, Bradford Wright. Have you ever read his book, The Comic Book Nation?
I don't think I have. I
He,
think sounds familiar though.
he's a comic book historian, and I remember one statistic very vividly from his book. He said, in the 40s and 50s, something like 90% of girls in America read comics, and like 95% of boys in America read comic books, which is astounding when you consider that only maybe a fraction of the population reads comic books today, and they're mostly middle-aged white men, right? So, I mean, there are other people and other demographics that read comic books as well, but that stereotype, I think, is something that we're still fighting against nowadays. But yeah, so you mentioned how the stories, they kind of transitioned during peacetime to focusing more on horror and crime, and they became very, very kind of adult oriented. But were adults actually reading these stories? That's actually one thing I don't even know. What do you think?
Not to a large percentage, because again, that was kind of the focal point of Wortham's whole argument, was it was corrupting the youth of America, because kids were getting access to stuff that, like, the adults were probably reading the spicy novels and whatever pulps were left. But no, the kid, and then the kids were, because for a while I'm guessing the parents didn't notice what their kids were reading, but then they might have
Right.
they might have found one of their kids' EC comics and was like, "Ooh, wait a minute,
Right. Yeah,
um,
they're just talking about funny books, right? They're like, oh, it's just my kid's funny book. And then you look inside and you're like, what? Right?
yeah,
And even some of the covers, like, they started getting a lot bolder as the time went on, and that kind of arms race between which company could do the better horror book, they started getting kind of out of hand with some of the covers, right?
Well, remember, you're fighting for newsstand space, and your book has to catch the eye of that kid.
Right.
And if you are a young boy, what's going to catch your attention faster than like a torn blouse or a slit skirt or something, on a woman in peril? I mean,
Right.
kids are kids, and they, I said, hell, that, hell, they didn't even have Playboy yet to go find their dad's stash. So this was probably as
Right.
close as they were going to come to that glimpse of stocking.
Exactly. And uh, when they in watching some interviews with Al Feldstein, he basically came up with this idea to start doing horror books, to the caliber that EC was doing them, and he was kind of drawing on his experiences with those old time radio shows from the 1930s, like Lights Out and Inner Sanctum and all those shows there. But beyond that, he didn't even really think that was going to take off the way it did, and it really did. So and I don't even think they thought that they were doing adult oriented type content, because they were putting like a humorous twist to it, with all the hosts in those EC books, which I find hilarious. But do you think that kids were finding it hilarious?
Well, I don't know, but it's, and again, the stories did, the bad guys did get their comeuppance in every
Mhm.
story,
Right.
just not always in the way that you expected. So, but again, it's hard to do an issue where the husband plots to do away with his wife, does it, and then through a twist of fate, he pays for his crime at the end. it's hard to sell that as any kind of moral story. Oh, sure, we had a gruesome murder on page 4, but hey, he paid for it on page 7. It's
Right.
that would be a tough sell to people that are judging it on the morality of the books.
Yeah, so they were almost kind of like cautionary tales in a way. Like, this is what'll happen if you plan to murder your mother or your wife or your husband or something, right? And that was actually kind of a recurring theme in those books. It was always like, especially the crime books, they would have like a love triangle, and then someone's always trying to get rid of the husband or the wife, right? So
yeah, there weren't a lot of happy marriages in comics.
No, not at all. Which is actually, I found really refreshing about the EC books, because when everyone thinks of the Eisenhower era, the 1950s, they think of the happy-go-lucky, white picket fence. This is what America should look like. And these books were doing stories about dysfunctional America, which I'm sure there were situations like those depicted in a lot of those EC books, minus the zombies and the ghouls, right?
Well, yeah. So, remember in those days, you didn't have a whole lot of entertainment options. We talk about why so many kids were reading comics then versus now.
Right.
I look at, hell, 20 years after the time period we're talking about, I can remember when I was a kid, the only form of entertainment I had control of was the book I was reading or the record I was playing. Because if you missed your favorite TV show, you had to hope it came out in reruns in the summer. Or if you missed if you missed a TV movie, you had to wait for them to show it again. I mean, you really, but comics were something everybody could go out and get. So, but again, you had to, even though there weren't many entertainment options, there were a ton of comic book options. So to make yours stand out, you wanted to do something that was going to capture kids' attention. And there's nothing that captures a kid's attention more than getting something they're not supposed to have.
Exactly. It's that I'm not supposed to be doing this, but I'm going to do it anyway, right?
Yeah, your parents aren't going to mind if you're reading New Funnies, but if they find out you're reading Tales from the Crypt, they might, So I'm sure there was a little bit of that getting one past the parents, coupled with the parents maybe not paying attention in the first place. But those comics definitely served a need that kids had to be entertained by. They'd do something in between radio broadcasts of their favorite team.
Right. Exactly. And you mentioned Dr. Wortham. So, now Dr. Wortham, the psychiatrist, is getting, starting to notice these books. And he, I think his logic was really flawed when he was connecting juvenile delinquency to, comic books, especially because modern studies now are attributing that rise in juvenile delinquency to just an increase in population, right? Like there was a boom in population after the war, and by the time all those kids who were born in the 1940s, they get to the 1950s, they're now kids and they can become juvenile delinquents. So that definitely was flawed. But after all of that comics code was implemented, the stories got even more, I would say, child oriented. Would you say?
Oh, without question. Now the DC comics had already started. I mean, Batman. When science fiction movies became popular, Batman's adventures started a lot of his adventures started taking place in outer space, and they were very, very kid friendly. And the companies that were publishing horror and crime and more adult science fiction type stories, they overnight had to either completely overhaul what they were doing or go out of business. And a lot of them went out of business. And some companies were able to adapt, but they became, instead of horror and violence, it became more mystery. Whether it was a science fiction story or Charlton did some really good mystery comics. And I think it's out of this world. A lot of Ditko stuff, and they just some people, because it was more of a challenge to entertain. Yeah, I always kind of compared to a lot of the movies in the 40s and 50s. The people that had to dance around the Hays Code and find ways, like if you've ever watched North by Northwest, we know what it means when the train goes in the tunnel.
Yeah.
And I'm sure even the people on the Hays Code knew too, but it's like, all right, we'll let that slide because, if you're not paying too close attention. But in comics, it became more of a challenge. How are we going to entertain, our readers? Because there's almost everything that we were doing is now off the table. So I will say that the one thing I backhandedly give Wortham credit for was, I'm not sure we would have gotten the superhero revival had it not been for the comics code being implemented, because they had to do something. And the Flash, the Barry Allen Flash came just a little over a year later. Because what are you going to do? I mean, I said, you can write a really cool mystery story about that man that saved the Earth because the aliens came, and and he had to figure out a way to get them to go back to their home planet or whatever. But it didn't. I guess they didn't have. If you were used to reading blood, guts, and gore, how are you going to get excited by that? So I'm sure in those days, a lot of those books suffered from readers that just were used to something so different, which kind of forced the industry to reevaluate again. And that I said, I think that might be why or National Periodical at the time went tried their hand at superheroes again.
Right. And for those of you that are not sure about what Eric's talking about with respect to the superhero revival, so after the war, superheroes were not popular. Most superheroes that appeared in the Golden Age, good number of them actually got canceled and never saw a page in a comic book again. So the only superheroes really that survived after the war were probably Batman, Superman,
Wonder Woman.
And Wonder Woman. Yeah. So those were the only three. So and Batman and Superman especially were kind of always incorporating the theme of the flavor of the month or the flavor of the year, whatever is popular in pop culture at the time, into their books. That's why all those Batman books were just full of aliens, because 1950s, we're starting to get into that atomic age and Area 51 and all these conspiracy theories about aliens. So science fiction movies got popular and they started incorporating that into the Batman books, and but the stories overall were pretty tame. It was kind of an example would be like, Superboy saving the class picnic by, toasting the hot dogs with his like heat vision, they were just really, really tame. Now, again, with respect to reading stories with comic books, I generally steer clear from the 1950s just because of that. Were there any stories that came to mind for you that were actually good during that, code era? Before the superheroes, I guess.
Oh gosh, dude. I don't. There's really not that many that I read. I mean, I said there's. I've gone back and gotten some of those books that Roy Thomas puts out, where he gets the public domain stuff, and like that's where I got a hold of those out of this worlds and things like that, and Adventures into the Unknown. I think after the code, they had to tone their stories down, and again, they read very well. And I said, I'm a fan of almost all comics in almost all ages, all eras. So I'm fine with that, because now, it's if I were living in that era and had read the comics that led up before the code, and then all I was left with were things like that, I'd probably look at it a lot differently. But now that it's decades in the rearview mirror, I can treat them as, pieces of comic book history, which makes it a lot easier to accept. But as far as, memorable stories, no, I don't think anybody could really, unless that is their era of expertise. There's clever story here and there, but nothing you can point to. So there was no Dark Knight Returns written in those years. So no.
Exactly. And McPuffin Muffin is asking, were the comics code ever legally enforced? Could the publishers be fined at the time for not sticking to those guidelines? Actually, no, it was not legally enforced, and they were just guidelines. Now, the reason why all of these publishers were so afraid of the comics code and, stuck to it so closely was because if they did not get that stamp, the public would generally steer clear of the book. So, Frederick Wortham did such a great smear campaign for comic books that, no publisher would dare put out a book without that seal of approval at the time anyway, for fear of the book basically just not selling at all.
Well,
Would you agree?
there's more to it than that even. Now, now Dell didn't bother to join the comics code because they didn't need to.
Right.
Their reputation was cemented as the all ages, stuff your teacher wouldn't even mind if you were reading in class type of stuff. But the reason why everybody else made damn sure that code seal was on there is newsstands wouldn't touch them because they were fearful of the reprisals. So
Right.
everybody, it just became like one big giant, group of people all converging on the comic book industry. So they had no choice because I said, if you can't get your books on the newsstand, you can't sell your books. And that was kind of like a condition where they all just, yeah, it wasn't mandatory, but it's sort of like you better go along with the group or you're done.
Yeah, or else. Yeah, exactly. No room for dissidence there, right? So, Yummy Buddy, welcome. He's just saying hello. So, welcome to the stream. Hope you enjoy it. Yeah, so we have the comics code, and now we get to the 1960s, and this is where things really start changing with respect to stories. And I'll kind of let you take the reins on that one, just because you were kind of more cognizant in that era than I was, because I didn't even exist.
Well, I was a youngin' there, and yes,
Yeah.
I was. Yeah, Kennedy was president when I was born. I am that old.
Yeah.
Now, what happened in the '60s? Yeah, and I'm going to pretty much stick to the big two for this.
Yeah, for sure.
DC had enjoyed a tremendous amount of success with the Flash, the Green Lantern. They decided they wanted to create a team book, so they did the Justice League, and other characters were starting to come in. Not long after, they brought back the Atom. Only this time it was Ray Palmer and not Al Pratt. They brought back Hawkman, totally changed his origin. Instead of being, the original, Hawkman was an Egyptian, reincarnated. Now he was a Thanagarian policeman that had come to Earth to, study, Earth police technology. But, over at, at the time, Atlas, and a little side note about Atlas, sometime in the mid 50s, National offered Martin Goodman $15,000 for the rights to Captain America, Submariner, and Human Torch.
Really? I didn't know that.
He turned him down because his response was, "I'm already rich. What do I need $15,000 for?" You think about if he had sold those, what would Stan have ever even gotten around to doing Fantastic Four? Or it says like what is forks in the road. I learned that about a year ago. I thought that I was fascinated by that. But anyway, so Martin went to Stan and said, they're doing this over at DC. Why don't you? Yeah, I want a superhero. I want a superhero team. And Stan had reached the end of his rope. He was planning on quitting, and his wife said, why don't you do one story your way, And then if it doesn't work out, well, you were quitting anyway. So that's what made him do the Fantastic Four. And unlike the Justice League, the Fantastic Four, didn't look like your cardboard cutout heroes. Hell, the thing was a misshapen monster. Uh, the one guy stretched, the other guy caught on fire, and they didn't always get along. And so that was another departure from the DC characters who, you know, would begin and end every adventure. It would all be tied up into a nice, neat little bow, generally in 12 pages, because like Green Lantern and Flash, Batman, Superman, they wouldn't be one continuous story. There would be 2 to 3 stories in an issue. Marvel did things differently. They did full length stories in Fantastic Four, um, and Spider-Man when it came out. Now, Thor and Journey into Mystery and the Hulk. Yeah, I think the Hulk, I think, did full length also.
Mm-hmm.
But and a couple years later, X-Men and Avengers. But their characters were different. They were more set in the real world instead of these fantasy towns like Gotham, Keystone, Metropolis. Marvel Comics took place in the real world, so he gave their characters real world problems. You had a superhero who, in his secret identity, wasn't sure he could pay his next bill, or whether he'd have enough money for Aunt May's medicine, being Spider-Man. But it was a whole different world. So even though there was a very restrictive code, still Marvel Comics felt so much more grown up than DC. So they started attracting an older audience. They were huge on colleges by the mid 60s.
Yeah, absolutely. And just a side note here, Lovell Lucas Jr. makes a good point here that Stan made the Thing a monster because around that time, monster comics were selling. Well, that's all like essentially Marvel was doing. Stan would even say in interviews like, every single week I was thinking of a new sound to name a new monster, because that's all like I was really doing. And that's when he ended up getting to the end of his rope, because he just couldn't stand doing those monster comics anymore. But you made a really good point about just about how Stan decided to do this and do it the way he wanted. Overall, comic books were vastly different than they were in the golden age by this point, and they really needed to shake things up, get creative, and because of the comics code. So when you mentioned earlier that you respected what happened with the whole Dr. Wortham thing, I totally agree with you, because without the Comics Code Authority and these publishers not knowing what to do, I kind of feel like that creativity would not have been sparked to try something different. And that's kind of what I kind of hold Frederick Wortham indirectly responsible for, kind of helping to birth the Marvel universe. Because if it wasn't for all of that, I don't think Stan would have done any of that. It just probably not. Yeah, what do you think?
No, I say you're right. Because if it wasn't for that, obviously, Julius Schwartz, God, I can't remember the other guy's name now, that decided to test the waters on superheroes to get the success that made Martin Goodman, because Martin Goodman was always a trend follower. Whatever was big, he'd wait to see what everybody else was doing, and then he would flood the market with his own stuff in a similar vein. So once he saw what was going on at National, he said, Stan, I want you to do this.
Right.
And unfortunately for them, no matter how much success they had, due to some problems they'd had in the late 50s, they were distributed through National. So they were only allowed to publish 8 books a month.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why you had all the split books like Tales to Astonish, Tales of Suspense, Journey into Mystery. So you could get, and they were all bi-monthly at the time. So it gave the illusion of having 16 books, and they could fit more characters into it. And it wasn't until 1960, late 67 and early 68 that deal changed, and Marvel was allowed to start publishing more books. And that's why all the split titles got all the characters got their own books. But yeah, it definitely, um, I think whether it was indirectly or directly, it definitely certainly did it at DC. And like I said, since Martin Goodman liked to follow trends, was responsible and indirectly for Marvel as well, or Atlas, soon to become Marvel.
Exactly. And Jesse Lynch is saying, if Marvel had not taken off, what do you think Stan would have done? Become the great American novelist, or gone to Charlton or DC? I personally think, I don't think he would have been like the next Tolstoy, like you say, Eric, or or written the great American novel. But I totally could have seen him as like the person, publishing dime novels, or like the early paperbacks that were sold in like grocery stores and pharmacies at the time. What about you? What do you think?
Yeah, I don't think he would have gone to Charlton or DC, because if you're saying if he had done the Fantastic Four, gotten the itch again, and it still didn't work, possibly. But if he had if he had never revived Marvel Comics, I could have seen him. I think he would have somehow found his way into television, television, on the movie industry, or he would have become a carnival barker.
Step right up here.
That's really what you think about all the the college, the lecture circuits he would go on.
Right.
I mean, he was a great promoter. He would have gone into some kind of promotion in television or film, I think. And it's just lucky for us that it did take off, because like I said, that the Lee and Kirby were magic. And I said, if they hadn't been in a position to do what they did, and again, like I said, that's why this is where I always mention poor Joe Maneely. If he had lived, I don't know if there would have ever been a Marvel Comics either, because there would have been no Marvel for Jack to come back to, because at the time they were running on a shoestring budget, doing mostly inventory stories. So I said, a lot of things had to break right for the industry to follow the trajectory it did in the 50s, 60s, and then into the 70s. I'm guessing we're going to be talking about soon.
Yeah, for sure. And we're going to jump to that actually right after this question here that Lovell Lucas Jr. is asking here. Do you think Marvel had more classic fantastical space adventures, or DC? I'm going to say Marvel. What about you?
Depends on what era. Yeah, I said, because the mystery in space through the 50s into the 60s was the in my opinion, the space book. I would say Marvel didn't really get space or cosmic until the early 70s, and a lot of that is Jim
Right.
Starlin.
And the only reason why I say that is because, as you know, most of my reading, takes place in the, books from the 70s and 80s. And I feel like there's so much space content in the Marvel books from the time. But yeah, like I said, I'm not very familiar with a lot of the earlier DC books. So yeah, I think you're right. It probably depends more on the era, for sure. So now let's get into the 70s, because now things change drastically here. And there are a few, I think, milestones that really kind of mark that shift to slightly more mature stories. And the one that I'm thinking of in particular, and I'm sure you're thinking of the same one, is Amazing Spider-Man 121 with the death of Gwen Stacy. I think that was the first time in comics that a major character was killed and actually stayed dead. Am I right?
Yeah, but I would go back a little farther to the Denny O'Neil, Neil Adams, Green Lantern, Green Arrow.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
About, taking I think the term was a stab at at realism, or oh God, that's how much
social relevance.
Relevance, thank you.
Yeah.
And Amazing Spider-Man 96 through 98, which actually, like I said, the like Food and Drug Administration, I think, came to Stan and
Right.
asked me this story. The code still wouldn't approve it, and Stan said, "Hell, with it, I'm gonna I'm gonna do it anyway." And I think that was what made it fairly obvious that the Comics Code Authority was losing their teeth. So
Right.
that's when they relaxed their stranglehold on certain plot points. They allowed the monsters to come back. You could again murder people in comics, and um
Right. Now, I have a question for you actually, with respect to that. So, Stan said, and this goes back to McPuffin Muffin's question about the Comics Code and adhering to it. And had Stan done that when the Comics Code was first conceived, that probably would not have gone over well, and that book probably would have not even really made it on the newsstands. But now we're in the early 70s. He does that, and the book takes off. What do you think was different between the 70s and when the code was first conceived that made that book so successful?
well, if there had been a major drug problem in the country at the time, we didn't know about it, because it
Exactly.
really wasn't until the 60s when people start more the suburbs and the urban areas collided, so to speak. Culture There was a massive culture shift in the 60s, and it's almost like America came of age. It was like things that were inconceivable in the 50s, like I said, striking out against your parents or deciding your parents weren't always right. Like I said, the 60s it's cliche to say the 60s were a decade of change, but it's like everything shifted. And I said, and things were more things became more out in the open. I mean, music changed, movies changed, everything changed. The way people lived. I mean, I said people weren't content to just live their white picket fence existence. They went out and sought out more, and a counterculture developed. And so I said, with that comes, with the good, also comes bad. So I said, drug use became more noticeable. I said it was something that obviously the government was worried about at the time. So that's why they came to Stan, as if that was going to change anybody's mind. But it made for a really good 3-part story.
Exactly. And I think that's what really kind of hit the nail on the head. 60s counterculture by this time was so ingrained in the social consciousness that, people were willing to accept a book that didn't have, this stupid stamp that kind of represents the establishment, really. So for some people, they could have been like, yeah, I'm going to pick up this book. And to be honest, I don't think anyone really noticed. Like,
I wasn't in the hobby at the time, so I don't know. I was too busy trying to complete my 1970 Topps baseball card set, I guess. Or 71, whatever those. But no, um and yeah, I said, to Marvel's credit also, I said Marvel touched on topics that were relevant throughout the 60s far more so than DC did. So it kind of felt more natural when Marvel did the Harry Osborn on drugs story. What Because if you go back and you read the O'Neill, Adams, Green Lantern, Green Arrow, it's more of a sledgehammer approach, because and Denny O'Neill is a very good writer, but again, it just stood out more at DC because you just didn't have that kind of. It's like the real world never intruded on the DC universe until then. And a lot of people say now, well, they're pretty simple stories, they're pretty ham-fisted, but you got to remember that was 50 years ago. So I said it's
yeah.
it's easy to look back now and say that, but those stories, I'm sure, packed a punch for its day. And even if the stories haven't aged well, those books are still in print. Those trades are still
Correct.
almost in every bookstore that sells a decent amount of comic book trades. So it has stood the test of time.
Absolutely. Those are probably considered some of the most important comics published. However, the public didn't really like them. They weren't really that popular because they only like that Green Lantern, Green Arrow book only lasted a few issues. And Neil Adams in an interview I remember I watched even said he passed by Julie Schwartz one day and said, "Hey Julie, how's Relevance doing?" And he looked at him and said, "Hey Neil, Relevance is dead." Like, and it kind of reminds me of what's going on today. People hate politics and comics today, and it's no surprise that back then, people didn't like being preached to or didn't like politics in their comics back then too.
And there's the difference. I said, yeah, the Green Lantern, Green Arrow did come across as preachy, but again, it was learning a different. Those kind of stories just weren't done at the time. They took a more heavy-handed approach, and they set it up to where they wanted to they wanted to encapsulate the growing political divide in the country. So Hal Jordan is the conservative Republican, and they turned Oliver Queen into the liberal Democrat. So they could play off each other, and they'd argue back and forth. And I'm just going to go on a limb here and say Denny O'Neil was very clear on who he wanted you to root for.
Oh yeah, well, Denny O'Neil was a hippie himself.
Yeah.
He was unapologetic about it.
Yeah, and actually, Oliver Queen was more of a hippie than even Denny O'Neil was. But again, like I said, when you're trying out something new, working. By the time they got the bugs worked out, the sales had come in and the book was canceled. Ironically, Neil Adams was the artist on X-Men when it was canceled too. And part of that, I truly believe, is comic book audiences may not have been ready for that realistic style of art either. Because at the time, DC employed their best artists on their war, science fiction, and romance titles. That's where Stan got John Romita. He was doing romance comics at DC.
Yeah.
But how much that mattered, who knows? But Marvel, I said, even the Harry Osborn story, there was more of something that everybody could get behind. I mean, it was easy to take sides there. Drugs bad, So for those two examples, but then to your point, you're right. Just a few years later, the death of Gwen Stacy, who some people refer to as the end of the Silver Age, depending on who you ask. Yeah, because that was a character that everybody knew, had grown to love, was killed and wasn't coming back. It was not a hoax, was not an imaginary story.
Exactly. And I just wanted to address this question real quick, just because I thought it was really interesting, is with the urban story. So I guess that's Green Lantern, Green Arrow 76. Story of Green Lantern, Green Arrow be a sledgehammer story, in your opinion?
It might have felt like that at the time, but again, you look back now, they're tame.
Yeah, exactly. But to be honest, that story is still reprinted today. Some classes in universities actually still kind of use that panel. It's the most reprinted panel in all of comics. And I don't want to get too political, but some people probably would say that that's still relevant today. And I just love that story where they have that black man. He's so he just looks like he's been through hell. And he says, you've helped the orange skins, you've helped the purple skins, but what have you done for the black skins? And I just thought that was such a powerful, text.
It was. But the problem with what he said is, it's kind of like same reason why I never wanted the big two to use 9/11 in continuity, because there are supervillains out there that have done far worse in comic books than knock down 2 buildings and kill 3,000. As crass as that sounds, you had a terrorist blow up a country in DC when Cheshire blew up the entire country of Iraq. You had Hank Henshaw wipe out Coast City with 7 million people. All that being relevant now, where that fits into my point is, Hal's answer could have easily been, what have I done? I have saved the universe. I've saved the world without a world, there's nothing. So I said it's kind of like it's almost like he did to make a point, but might have been barking up the wrong tree. That would have been a better lecture to give to maybe Batman.
Right.
So but again, it was a Green Lantern book, so it got the message across. But in a comic book sense, saying that to a cosmic superhero who says literally saved the universe on any number of occasions, certainly saved the world. It kind of, again, it's like you're yelling at the wrong guy, maybe. Yeah, but again, it was, the point was made, and that's why they did it there, and it's just, Green Lantern was the vehicle to, to do that story, and so that's why it was done.
Absolutely. And just a quick question, because I personally have always wanted to know this, and then we'll get back to this. But just to go off on a tangent very briefly, you mentioned how around the time of 9/11 that that incident was not used in main comic book continuity, and just based on comic book history, where they had the superheroes go to war in the 1940s. Okay. Why did we not see Captain America hunting down terrorists? Why did we not see, why didn't we start seeing terrorists popping up in books and these superheroes stopping them?
It depends on what area you're talking about.
At the time of 9/11.
Probably just figured it was too touchy a subject. I mean, that's a good question. And again, comics are supposed to be an escape. And for many, many years, they were. And if you start having larger than life superheroes taking on real life terrorists, it might be, well, if they're already, there's already movies like that. There's already books like that. So, we read comics to escape. I mean, you can have, terror groups that are led by a supervillain or something like that. But I mean, everything about comics is supposed to be larger than life. And as I said,
Right.
When 9/11 happened, I thought the tributes were done very well, but I just didn't want to see it brought into
Main continuity.
Continuity, because it's just, like I said, you can dream up. I said when the Phoenix got hungry and ate a planet of 5 billion. I said it's and I know this comes across as me being crass as hell, but I'm
and this
is the real world is the real world, and that was as bad as it gets, for any single strike. But again, like I said, and that's where it should, to me, that's where it should stay, in the real world.
Correct. Yeah, and I think and that's probably what the publishers were thinking at the time too, because I think, well, as Lovell here is saying too, like, seeing Dr. Doom and Magneto sad about 9/11 didn't really feel real, considering what they've done in the past. Like, that's totally, I would totally agree with that. Like, I still remember vividly that panel from I think it was like Amazing Spider-Man, the one with the black cover there, where Dr. Doom's like crying and you could see the tears escaping from his mask. And I'm like, it doesn't really seem like a Dr. Doom thing to do, but whatever, I get it. It's a tribute book, so, but okay. So moving, because I think we're going to go a little longer today because we're only at the 70s. So before we move on to the 80s, besides, Gwen Stacy, the Stan book being published without the Comics Code stamp, were there any other incidents in the 1970s you felt really kind of marked that shift to these darker stories?
Well, the Joker resumed his homicidal tendencies in Batman 251, I believe it was, because he had spent, he'd spent a couple decades just being the merry prankster, kind of like the Cesar Romero character in the Batman series. So Denny O'Neil brought that back, and he brought the introduction to Ra's al Ghul, or Ra's, how you pronounce that,
right?
When they introduced him in Batman 232, but then there was a 3-part story in 242, 3, and 4, where it's one of the best Batman stories I've ever read. where it begins with the premise of Robin being kidnapped, and Ra's al Ghul comes to Batman and tells him that his daughter's been kidnapped too. And of course, it's a setup. He's basically testing Bruce to see if he's a worthy son-in-law candidate because his daughter's fallen in love with him. But it introduces Matches Malone, a character that everybody's heard of, but who was actually only alive for 3 panels. And then Batman started using him as a cover identity, and he's lasted another 50 years.
Yeah, exactly. You still see him in comics today.
Yeah. But that was, that felt, everything about that story felt grown up, from O'Neill's writing to Adam's art, and there felt like there were consequences. And it was, I said, that was a sign that maybe comics were starting to grow up a little bit. And then as the decade wore on, you started seeing, you started seeing adult themes starting to creep in. They really didn't kick into high gear until the 80s, though.
Exactly. And before we get into the 80s here, just a few great comments here. Adrian Bedingfield here is saying that, terrorist groups might try to target the comic book companies. And that's not far-fetched. I mean, we saw that at Charlie Hebdo. We saw that,
Yep.
So that's for sure. And then I thought this was an interesting comment as well, that Marvel experimented with putting their heroes in Vietnam stories. I actually didn't know that. And the reader reaction caused them probably to stop that. And that was a touchy subject as well. So that's probably why they kind of steered clear of that.
And Stan had always said he wanted his books to remain neutral as possible.
Right.
Because he, unlike the vast majority of today's creators, he wanted everybody to read his books.
Right.
And if you didn't, you could touch on relevant topics without blatantly taking a side, and both sides can feel like they're getting something out of a book.
Right.
Because they would present both sides. If they, I can remember an issue where, in Spider-Man in the late 60s, when all the, protests were going on, and some of the students got mad at Peter because he wouldn't carry a sign. And, his response was something like, why am I going to protest something I'm not even sure I believe in, or whatever? So it's like, and I'm probably getting that wrong, but they would present both sides of things and let the reader decide.
Exactly. And this is another good point. Introduction of Wolverine started something unconventional or unintentionally dark. And for sure. I mean, Wolverine wasn't too crazy at the beginning, but he definitely was this kind of like loose cannon anti-hero type character. And this is actually, all these great comments are coming in now. At the beginning, where I was like trying to pull teeth to get people to talk. Where was that one here? It was about hang on a sec. Oh, Keith, here we go. Keith Griffin's first Omega Men series was the moment comics got adult to me. Haven't read it. Have you read it?
Yeah, it was. Yeah, it to me, it kind of felt sort of like an X-Men title, and some of the characters you could make parallels to. Like I was kind of figured that Primus was Scott, like Igor was his name, was their Wolverine. And that's the comic that introduced Lobo, was
right.
3. They didn't realize what they had, because I'm not sure how many issues he did appear in, but that's one of those books that I haven't gone back and read, but if I could get trades of it, because it's very hard to find those, and plus, you can buy the other 35 issues for less money than you can get a copy of number 3. Because there's nothing like when a huge character has his first appearance in an otherwise, hard to track down series, because that's 30 something years old now, and most comic shops, won't bother. But if it ever is, and I'm assuming it hasn't been, but if you ever get a chance to get a hold of that series, I highly recommend it. I'd like to read it again.
Yeah, absolutely. So now we're in the 80s, and a whole crap load of stuff happens in the 1980s that, makes things more mature. So I'm going to try to list them real quick, and then we can so we have, the Phoenix, Jean Grey dying. We have, let's see here, Dark Knight Returns. We have Watchmen. We have Crisis on Infinite Earths with those, those covers like the Flash dying, Supergirl dying. Help me out here. Am I missing anything?
Avengers 213. The Hank hits his wife.
Oh yeah. Hank hits his wife. Iron Man becomes an alcoholic. Hulk, we find out that he was abused as a child. So all these really, what the heck was happening where they decided to start including all these like really heavy topics?
I'm sure that there's probably some reasons that I'm not even thinking of, and maybe it was a response to comics being made in other parts of the world. But I think Frank Miller coming along on Daredevil and expanding on what Roger McKenzie had started, that just turned superhero comics on its ear. And again, you touched on the X-Men. Yeah, I mean, Jean Grey didn't do anything different than Galactus, but Galactus was not a member of a superhero team. So when she killed that world, basically consumed that world in her hunger, it was like, wow. I mean, that's, because you realize that there's no getting out of this. And then, all the ones that you touched on, I said, Dark Knight Returns, you can argue back and forth whether or not that did the industry any favors, because for years and years and years, everybody tried to do their own Dark Knight with, their characters. And, it was like Frank Miller even said, I didn't intend for this to be the template for all future Batman stories. It was just, a story. And, kind of the same thing with Watchmen. So it's unfortunately the imitations are never as good as the originals.
Exactly.
And not to say that there haven't been great Batman stories, because my opinion, there are a lot of Batman stories I like better than Dark Knight Returns. I know it's sacrilegious to say that, but
it's sacred text. You can't do that.
I'm sorry. Tune in next week when there'll be a different person sitting in the chair talking to Dante.
Yeah, no. Killing Joke, now that you mention it, is another one too. But like, there's just so much happening in the 80s, and I think Dark Knight is really kind of what kicked it off. We had all those other things that kind of predated Dark Knight, but I mean, Dark Knight's really what kind of kicked it off. Let me just kind of click on some of here. So we have the Venom murders in the 80s, Mutant Massacre of the Morlocks. That's another one. Teen Titans, so it's just so much. But I really think it was Dark Knight that kind of, started that frenzy for these, dark, mature stories. And that's something we're even seeing today. Like the template of Batman and who Batman is today was started by Frank Miller, essentially.
Well, I would say, I don't know if Frank Miller ever gets the idea to do that if it wasn't for what Denny O'Neil did.
Right.
Starting in the early 70s. So that gave him an idea that it could be done. He just, injected it with, a ton of, Batman growth hormones, and, just really, went to town on it. And we also let that, and I mentioned this before, said, I think it was in the 80s when Cheshire blew up the country of, Kirok also. So I said, that's, things that were, if they happened in comics before that, they happened, in a distant solar system. And I know that's what happened with the Phoenix, but still, that was done by, like I said, at the time, what we thought was Jean Grey. So that's just gave that so. Oh, and then Adrian there bringing up Hellblazer and Alan Moore's Swamp Thing. I mean, it's just the 80s. Like I said, the code was basically just a stamp on a comic by then,
right?
And again, movies that started getting a lot grittier in the 70s. In the 80s, we got more action oriented, and then comics had to maybe since comics couldn't replicate the action of a Schwarzenegger movie, they had to come up with something to keep readers engaged. And I think can you top this on whatever comic violence or mayhem you could come up with?
Right. And I think the thing is too, the Robin death, that's another one too. I talk about that one a lot. The Rob that was huge. But I think the thing is that comic books from generally, because the readers of comic books from the 1960s and 70s were not, the same as the readers from the golden age. By this time, the readers from the golden age, in the 70s and 80s, they have been long out of comics for the most part, right? But I think what happened in the 80s is, comics kind of aged and grew up with a lot of the comic book readers, right? So you have these Gen Xers, that were born in the 60s. Are you considered a Gen X? No, you're a boomer technically, aren't you?
Yeah, by 2 years, I think.
By 2 years, yeah. But so most of the Gen Xers, they're growing up, they're in the 80s. They're not wanting to read the same old stuff that they remember from when they were a kid. They want these more, mature stories, hence the movies too, like you mentioned the movies.
Well, something else that is two words that changed the industry forever: direct and market.
That's another one. Yep.
Because if you were selling directly to comic shops, the code couldn't touch you, and so I said that
Right.
That's why all the bigger name special projects or whatever, and Marvel was doing direct, started doing some direct market like with Dazzler and Kazar, and they didn't have to be code approved, although there really wasn't anything in either one that wouldn't have been. But and that changed the comics landscape, because if you're going to have stores, your business is devoted to for all intents and purposes strictly for comics, you're going to have to give people more than just what they were used to, and that forced comics to really grow and change, even more so in the 80s probably than in any decade.
Not only that, but the comic book industries at this time started recognizing that, hey, we have older people that are reading our books now. Let's start, charging older people prices for our older people books. So you started getting all these exclusive, graphic novels and prestige editions of these books that were only sold in comic shops. So, now you got people leaving the newsstands to get into the comic shops to get these exclusive items that were priced much higher than your, monthly comic books. So that also, I think, kind of contributed to it as well.
That's a good point.
Yeah. Now, obviously, things are just go nuts in the 90s. That was to the point where it almost, a lot of people would kind of describe it as hyper masculine or toxically masculine. What do you think?
Well, I'd say the 80s into the 90s was where the sublime turned into the ridiculous.
Right.
And I don't necessarily mean that in a bad way. I mean, the 90s comics served served a need that we obviously had. I think there were more fans that, because I said that might have grown up, or like all those action movies of the 80s, they might have been a little bit too young for them. So the comics of the early 90s kind of felt like those Schwarzenegger, really. Look at like the original Image comics. Yeah, at Marvel, all the characters, became darker and edgier, and I said, more violent. I mean, if you find a way to make, they found a way to make Frank Castle more violent. I mean, and then and every book had Punisher, Wolverine, or Ghost Rider. I mean, they just 90s took the problem with the 90s was any decent idea they had got absolutely run into the ground and then pulled back out and run into the ground again. It was, it's like if this much is good, they're gonna love this. And I think comics spent the vast majority of the 90s shooting themselves in the foot because as
Yeah.
big as Image was in the early 90s, by the end of the 90s, the fad had worn off. And even though Image was doing all kinds of great stuff by then, nobody cared. Marvel made so many mistakes in the first half of the 90s that, they had to they had to rent some of their characters to Image. And then when they came back, they started doing great stuff again. Nobody cared. DC was doing great stuff all through the 90s. And boy, did nobody care. So, which was a shame because I said they really did publish, so many more good books in the 90s than Marvel. But hell, but they other than Batman and Justice League, they couldn't sell.
Right, exactly. So yeah, that is definitely the issue there, and it almost kind of became this race to kind of one up each other, kind of like it was in the 50s with the horror books, right? So I just thought that was, I mean, and I like a lot of 90s books. It's so there's a lot of garbage, but there's a lot of great stuff too.
But now, there. I don't know that the 90s books will be thought of with the reverence they are if modern comics, say what you will about them, they've lost their sense of fun for the most part. And 90s comics were fun, if nothing else. Each issue, the guns got bigger, something else got bigger, and the heads got smaller. I
Exactly.
mean, it was amazing. You'd see these Image guys. I said their heads would be like, it was like, what was it, Pinhead from the old Moon Studio movies or whatever, that got a huge body and it's like literally the Pinhead.
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
But yeah, but I said that they're fun reads. They're nothing that you're gonna use as an example of great literature, but those early stories had their place. I mean, they were absolutely style over substance, but that's what the people wanted at the time. I mean,
Exactly.
some of those Image books sold a ton.
And exactly. Yeah, for sure. And a lot of that early Image stuff for me is basically unreadable. Aside from Spawn, I really enjoyed Spawn, but a lot of that early Image stuff was just unreadable for me. But now I don't mean to fast forward through it, but I did want to get to talking to modern day. So what do you think the kind of the spirit is in modern day? Because we're kind of in a, things are definitely toned down. From how they were in the 90s, but I feel like there's a little bit more variety in what the companies are doing now. What would you say is kind of like the spirit now? Would you say it's really adult oriented, or would you say it's kind of generally tame?
A little of both. There's so many options for as far as indie comics, so you can pretty much get any kind of story you want. And if you can't find it there's probably somebody doing it in an Indiegogo or a Kickstarter campaign. The big two have, I think both of them have fallen into the trap of everything has to be an event. It's almost
Right.
like they've painted themselves into a corner and they don't have confidence anymore that fans will be willing to just read just a one or two issue story. One of the popular YouTubers used to be Diversity in Comics, Nice Comics Matters with your boy Zach. He said, just one time I want to see Superman or see Batman stop a bank robbery. Yeah, I guess because you don't get any of that anymore. The supporting casts of books are gone. Subplots are, involving the non-powered cast members are gone. And it's like everything is like, can you top this? At any given time, you could have 4 or 5, universe-ending scenarios going on, and to me, it's just it. It's hard to if everything is an event, then nothing's an event. If everything's a universe-ending threat, then really nothing is. And between that and the in paying more attention to identity politics. Again, that if I don't mind comics treading in the real world, but it, yeah, if you're reading a comic book, I want to see a Superman that looks like Mr. Olympus. I don't want to see Superman with a dad bod because someone's decided, well, that's more realistic in the real world. Well,
Right.
comics aren't the real world. So I'm kind of contradicting myself a little bit, but there's a balance. Comics are supposed to be an escape from real life,
Right.
and I think that's something that comics in general has kind of forgotten because we get there's no escape from our politics in daily life now. It's omnipresent, and
Absolutely.
it would be nice to open up a comic and just having good guys fighting bad guys again once in a while.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know what? I think we're probably going to have to continue this discussion next week, and have next week's theme kind of piggyback off of this one, and kind of talk a little bit about the politics in comics, whether it be from the 90s or even today, because I feel like we're getting so much great content for discussion here now that we're nearing the end of our show.
If I may say, I want to say hello to Maranya. Thank you for dropping by. Jerry Smith, he's actually one of my oldest friends in real life. He's actually
Wonderful.
he
Welcome.
filmed. He's the cameraman on my video. So
Oh, I was
yeah,
wondering. I'm like, who's doing the camera? I'm like, is it his cat?
That would be him. He hasn't found out a way to filter my chins or my gut out, but that's probably too big a job for anybody. And Dominic Powell, great guy.
Awesome.
Yeah, so it's nice to
Welcome.
see a couple of familiar names.
And before we wrap up for today, I just wanted to tell everyone to go and check out Eric's YouTube channel, because his videos are pretty entertaining. I have to say, always really good commentary with his videos. But yeah, like I said, I think we're gonna have to continue this discussion next week. We'll kind of wrap up what we're talking about today, and maybe start talking a little bit about maybe politics and identity politics in comics a little bit, because I'm sure we can stir up some really good conversation next week as well. You're already like, yep, it's gonna be one of those episodes.
We've done 3 of these, and I don't think I've pissed anybody off yet. So
It
by all means,
happens.
give me an
It
opportunity to change that next week.
Seriously, it happens, and you get used to it. I got people yelling at me in comments all the time whenever I post a video, so it's fine. You get used to it. You develop Colossus thick skin. So, but anyway, Eric, thank you once again for joining us, and thank you to all of you who joined us. I'm thinking now I'm gonna have to kind of like make the show just a little bit later, maybe around 8:30, because I feel like everybody shows up kind of more around like that 8:30 mark. Maybe 8 o'clock's a little too early for everyone, but I will check out the Instagram channel account and Twitter. I'll be posting news about that in the coming weeks. So, and also please check out the new video. I posted a new video today about the top collectible Star Wars comics that you should invest in right now, because Star Wars comics are really, really hot. Eric, I know you don't like Star Wars comics. Eric's not really a real nerd because he doesn't like Star Wars, but
I do have a lot of non nerd, there are a lot of things that have me turning in my nerd cards.
Yeah, right. Exactly. But anyway, thank you once again to all of you for joining us. I really hope to see you all back again next week. We will for sure be back again next week, just because this was just such a great discussion that we had here tonight. So it's Friday. Go out, have some fun. Please stay safe, and stay home. Don't try to mingle with too many people, just so we can, not until we get all our vaccines, right? So have a great weekend, and we'll see you in an upcoming video. Thanks again.
Good night, kids. Why are we still on, and why is it all me?